sports fans. Can't get enough Major League Soccer action? Want to catch more spectacular goals by Kobe Jones, Brian McBride, and Clint Mathis? Fantastic saves by Tony Meola and Tim Howard?
My memory's a little foggy on all of this because I've coached too many years, and the coaching just kind of consumes all these parts of your brain. So, but Bob and I were tight, and so I knew of Bob before transferring into the union business.
Yeah, in 2003, I was doing several different things. I was still practicing law in a small firm with varying clients, corporate clients, and doing some work in healthcare. We'd started up a couple of small companies in the healthcare space and doing some venture investing in that area as well. It wasn't just a single meeting or a single request that got us started on the path towards forming a union. It was more a series of conversations that were happening across the player pool and across the player side of the industry. After Frazier, it was clear the next move that made sense legally was to form a union. So the obvious question that flowed out of that was, who's going to help us figure out how to do that? And since I was a lawyer, I was asked to help figure it out, and it sounded like an interesting thing to do. I didn't know anything about that other than labor law and law school, but I thought it sounded like an interesting combination of helping guys who really needed the help and the sports world, which I had an interest in and some experience in, and learning new things, taking on new projects, which was exciting to me. And lastly, the idea of sort of helping to build an organization really appealed to me. Thankfully, we were smart enough to realize up front that the one thing we really don't have any experience with and need is a pure union side labor lawyer.
I was doing what I'm doing now. I mean, I was at my same law firm. I was a little younger then. And we're a union side labor law firm. That's all we do is represent labor unions. And so Bob somehow got connected with us. I think he called at that time my senior partner who's since retired, and he walked into our office and said, he's there, and there were some players he was there on behalf of, and talked about literally how do you form a union. And I think there was this notion that it's like forming a corporation or something like that, which is completely different. So we walked through the processes and what it would take to form a union, and what it means to form a union, and how you get recognized, and what that means, and all of those things. So, I mean, that's what I do for a living. So that was easy. And honestly, I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought, yeah, this will never happen, and I'll probably never see this guy again. But he was persistent, and the players were persistent.
I think it's safe to say that neither John or I realized most of what was going to then happen, but we went out to the players and told them, or when we went out to the players, we told them we wouldn't take any money, we wouldn't get paid until we had a deal done, and we showed them results, which sounded like a logical thing to do at the time. But 18 months into the process, that was a little more challenging than we expected it to be.
So we started a card check drive, which is what you do to form a union. You have to demonstrate that the workers want a union. So it explained to him that the players had to authorize the union.
We literally printed up hard stock authorization cards and mailed them through the U.S. Postal Service over, to each player in the league. It was over the off season, so they weren't together. So we had to get home addresses or off-season addresses and send them out and get guys to send them back. So it was literally stuffing envelopes and putting return envelopes into them and sending them out to guys and waiting for them to come back. So that was our process. It was not sophisticated.
I distinctly remember the certification cards, right? I remember that. I remember talking to the guys in the locker room and saying, listen, this is a big deal. This is something we need to do. And the other cool thing about collective action, especially in the context of soccer, right, is that we had all these different types of people. We had these superstar European people like Peter Novak and Lubos Kubik, who were older with families, and then we had guys like DeMarcus Beasley, who didn't even go to college, right? And his brother Jamar, and then guys who, graduated from schools anywhere from like UCLA to Princeton or Duke or Cal State Fullerton, and then we had people with language barriers, English as a second language or hardly at all. So we had all of this like varied group of individuals who we all wanted the same thing. We were all being treated very differently.
So there were about 240 players, and let's say there were 240, as long as we demonstrated that we had 121 cards, that would be sufficient. We had, I think we had 95% or something. We had an overwhelming majority of cards. But the league had, I remember this, they had these 3-ring binders of contracts with all the players. I grabbed one. I just grabbed it and opened it up. And one of the league officials, not the commissioner, someone who was then young at the time, just freaked out and looked at his lawyer and said, that's confidential. Can you see that? And I remember this distinctly because the lawyer said, again now.
When I think back upon that time, the number one thing that jumps out is, where do we start? How do we get this going? And how do we identify somebody in each team that's ready to take on this type of responsibility to be a leader within the locker room, within the team, that can influence a group of players in a positive way? Like, how do we get everybody on board? And will everybody be on board? And how do we do that? And so we would talk to NFLPA, we would get some insight from other PAs in different sports, and through that guidance, we pieced it together, and it was interesting. I happened to be in a locker room where there were a lot of experienced players. So we had Josh Wolf, we had Chris Klein, we had Preki, Tony Miola. We had guys that had lived it, when we think about Tony in particular, with U.S. soccer for many, many years, playing in multiple World Cups and going through their evolution of fighting for more things and getting... So you get these bits and pieces from the older guys, you tie it in with some very good leaders within that locker room, and we had a nice, healthy team that would talk openly about this stuff, but that doesn't mean that was existing in other places. And so I think just getting started and getting everybody on the same page was probably the hardest thing to do. But once we got there and once we got Bob and Jon involved, it became a lot easier to, all right, let's talk this out. Let's think through how we want to attack this in a way that's hopefully going to be palatable for MLS, so that they recognize us as quickly as they can and give us that respect that we think that we deserve.
Yeah, I remember, hearing about it. I remember not knowing what to think. I think we all kind of took it for granted. I think we all felt like not a whole lot would change, mostly because, we were being told that this league is like, it's barely holding together. So, how much could you really rock the boat? How much could you ask for things as players? All those things kind of played into this information that you're getting. There's going to be a players union. Certainly Bob and Jon came and they would speak to teams and things like that. I think most guys tuned out of that a little bit. That's it's kind of like professional sports. If you're just barely holding on to your spot on the team, to your contract, to all those things, for us it was a little bit, it was almost too much, right? We were trying to figure out what was going on just in our own careers, and now we have we're starting to hear there's a players union. There's does that mean we can strike? Does that mean they can lock us out? And so I think at the time it was a lot of information coming in, but it wasn't necessarily 100% clear as to what it meant.
We would have talks, I remember, and those talks started to develop, and I think we got more influential players in those talks, whether it was Alexi Lawless, Tim Howard, Landon Donovan, Chris Klein, I know, was involved in those early discussions and put together this executive board that was it was really just that board and Bob, from my recollection, for a long time. And of course, we would talk to others in our teams and things like that, but that was a real focus group for a long time. And there's some sharp guys in there and some influential guys.
I was unique. I've always been unique in that there are things about me that I'm very selfish about and want to do well. That's part of being human. with our league and players with the national team too, I always had a vision of what can I help do to make this the best for everyone. There were points where I was making a lot of money, and the best thing for me and what I would have fought for is charter flights. I didn't want to sit in Southwest flights anymore, but that wasn't what guys making 25 grand cared about. They wanted to make more money. So I was able to put that aside, and I wanted to make sure that somebody in my position who was one of the stars of the league making good money could then sit at the table and say, no, you know what, we need to fight for higher minimum salary versus free agency so I could move somewhere I wanted to, or charter planes so I could fly more comfortably. And I think we had a number of guys, not always 100% of the time, but most of the time, guys who saw the big picture and what's best for everyone.
I remember meeting at Lake Forest College. We had our first meeting. This is where we trained at the time. And Bob and Jon were there, at the start of their career. Yeah, I mean, it was, and again, coming out of college, you're just happy to have a job. You're excited about having a job. And then to start to think about more broadly the player pool as a whole instead of just me as an individual. It's, something that any young professional is not usually thinking about. But with great leadership and both in terms of from Bob and Jon, but also from the leaders within the league, the players within the league. It was clear, a clear direction and a clear understanding of what our role was and is in the advancement of the league.
I come from a union background, my family. So my father was a very active union member in Burnaby in Vancouver, suburb of Vancouver, Teachers Federation, and became a politician on the school board. So I always came from a pretty left-leaning union family. So for me, when I knew there was an opportunity, there was a union and someone kind of standing up for players, because it had those experiences since '87, teams folding, not getting paid, finding this out, it was nice to have someone there that was, you knew had your back and someone to go to if there were issues.
I think, Bob and Jon did a great job of, again, starting to lay out what it meant, what it means. The players were asking questions, weren't necessarily getting answers. I think they did a good job of that when we would have meetings. I think guys were now starting to attend meetings a little bit more than they would before. And I think once guys started to understand it and started having conversations amongst themselves, and then we started realizing the importance of it, then we started realizing, well, we could change, not everything, but some things at least,